My name is Elsie, I'm 35 years old, and until recently, I was living what I thought was a pretty good life. I own a small fitness club in the suburbs of Chicago, where I work as both the director and administrator. My husband, Mark, and I have been married for 10 years. We live in a cozy house I inherited from my grandmother. It's not fancy, but it's home. Mark works in customs, a job he's always been proud of. When we got married, we agreed to keep our finances mostly separate but contribute to a joint account for shared expenses. It seemed like a good system at the time, and it worked well for years. I've always wanted children, but despite our efforts, I couldn't get pregnant. I went through countless tests and examinations, but the doctors couldn't find anything wrong. Mark, on the other hand, refused to get checked. He kept saying I was obsessed with the idea of pregnancy and that we should just let nature take its course. Things started to change about 6 months ago. Mark's mother fell ill. Her insurance wasn't enough to cover her treatment and medications. She called me, her voice weak and trembling. "Elsie, dear," she said. "I hate to ask, but could you help me out? Just until I get back on my feet." I couldn't say no. She was family, after all. So I started transferring money from our joint account to her every month. It was becoming a real burden, but I told myself it was temporary. It was a warm Saturday evening when our friends, Tom and Lisa, came over with their 2 kids. As I played with 5-year-old Emily and 3-year-old Jack, I felt a familiar ache in my chest. This was what I wanted so badly, the laughter of children, the pitter-patter of little feet. "Hey, Mark," Tom called out. "Let's grab a beer on the terrace. It's a nice night." Mark nodded, seemingly relieved to escape the chaos of children. As the men headed outside, Lisa turned to me with a sympathetic smile. "Elsie, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you and Mark ever considered adoption? I mean, if having kids is so important to you." I felt my cheeks flush. We haven't really discussed it," I stammered. "I still hope that maybe, with IVF." Lisa nodded, but I could see the pity in her eyes. I couldn't bear it anymore. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm just going to check if the guys need anything." I stepped out onto the terrace, grateful for the cool evening air on my flushed face. I was about to announce my presence when I heard Mark's low voice. "Check this out, man," he was saying. I peered around the corner to see him showing Tom something on his phone. "Her name's Amber. 28, smoking hot." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Tom let out a low whistle. "Damn, Mark. But what about Elsie?" Mark snorted. "Elsie? She's getting old, man. Amber, though? She's perfect. Young, fertile, and way hotter than Elsie ever was." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. But what Mark said next made my blood run cold. "You want to know the best part?" Mark chuckled. "Elsie thinks she's the one who's infertile. She has no idea I've been taking pills to make myself sterile. I don't want kids with her, never did." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I plastered on a smile, played the perfect hostess, all while my world was crumbling around me. The next morning, I made a decision. I needed answers, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. 2 weeks later, I sat in a nondescript cafe, my hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, as the investigator, a man named Rick, laid out the ugly truth. "Mrs. Johnson," Rick said, his voice matter of fact. "Your husband has been having an affair for approximately 1 year. The woman's name is indeed Amber, and she's 28 years old." I nodded, numb. This I had expected. But Rick wasn't done. "There's more," he continued. "Your mother-in-law is aware of the affair. In fact, she often transfers money to your husband or pays for their joint trips. They frequently spend weekends together, your husband, his mother, and Amber." I felt sick. "The money I've been sending her for medical bills." Rick nodded grimly. "It appears she's been funneling it back to your husband." But the final blow was yet to come. Rick pushed a folder across the table. Your husband has been systematically transferring joint property to his mother's name. He's also been making regular small withdrawals from your joint account, which we've traced to expenses related to Amber. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with everything I'd learned. The betrayal cut deep, but I knew I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. I needed a plan. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Mark's car was there. Strange, he usually worked late on Wednesdays. Then I saw his mother's car parked behind his. I walked in to find Mark and his mother, Linda, sitting at the dining table. They were hunched over some papers, talking in low voices. They both looked up when I entered, surprise evident on their faces. "Elsie," Mark exclaimed, hastily shuffling the papers. "You're home early." I forced a smile. "Just wrapped up at the club a bit sooner than expected." "Hi, Linda. I didn't know you were coming over today." Linda smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, just dropping by to check on my boy. How are you, dear? You look tired." "I'm fine," I said, keeping my voice light. "Actually, I have some news. Mark, I've scheduled you for a medical checkup next week. To make sure everything's okay with, your fertility." The effect was immediate. Linda's face drained of color, and Mark's eyes widened in panic. "What? Why would you do that?" Mark sputtered. "I told you, I don't need." "It's just a precaution," I interrupted smoothly. "After all, we've been trying for so long. It's only fair we both get checked out, right?" Mark's face hardened. "Drop it, Elsie. You're too old for kids anyway." The room fell silent. Linda looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. I let the silence stretch, watching Mark squirm. Finally, I spoke. "You're right, Mark. Maybe I am too old. For a lot of things, actually." I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope. "Like this marriage, for instance. These are the divorce papers. I know about Amber, Mark. I know about the affair, the money, all of it." Mark's face cycled through shock, anger, and finally settled on a smug smirk. Well. Looks like the cat's out of the bag. You know what? I'm glad. I've been wanting out of this sham marriage for years." His callousness stunned me, but I pressed on. "I want you out of the house. Today." Mark laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You can't kick me out. This house? Your precious little business? I'm taking it all, Elsie. I've been planning for this." I felt a chill run down my spine. "We'll see about that in court." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Court? Oh, honey. You have no idea who you're messing with. I've got friends in high places. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be lucky if you can get a job flipping burgers." They left, laughing and whispering to each other. As the door closed behind them, I sank to the floor, my legs no longer able to support me. The next few days were a blur of activity. I threw myself into gathering evidence, speaking with lawyers, and trying to keep my business running smoothly. I was determined not to let Mark's threats get to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the other shoe was about to drop. I didn't have to wait long. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was at the fitness club, going over some paperwork in my office. Suddenly, I heard a commotion outside. I stepped out to find two stern-looking men in suits, flashing badges at my startled receptionist. "Elsie Johnson?" one of them asked as I approached. I nodded, my heart racing. "That's me. Can I help you?" "We're from the Department of Health and Safety. We've received a complaint about this establishment. We need to conduct an inspection." I felt a chill run down my spine. This had Mark written all over it. But I kept my cool. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "I'd be happy to show you around. All our licenses and paperwork are up to date." The inspection was grueling. They checked every nook and cranny, pored over every document. I answered their questions calmly and professionally, even as my stomach churned with anxiety. After what felt like hours, the lead inspector finally looked up from his clipboard. "Everything seems to be in order, Mrs. Johnson. Your licenses are valid, and we found no violations. Have a good day." My phone rang barely 10 minutes later. Mark's number flashed on the screen. I considered ignoring it, but decided to face him head-on. "How did you like your little visit today, Elsie?" His voice dripped with smug satisfaction. "Oh, that was just a warm-up, sweetheart. You have no idea what's coming. Your precious little gem? It'll be mine soon enough. And that's just the start." "Is that a threat?" I asked, my anger rising. "It's a promise," he sneered. "But I'm feeling generous. How about a deal? You give up your claims to our joint property, sign over the house to me, and forget about the money I've spent. In return, I'll leave you and your pathetic little business alone. What do you say?" I was speechless for a moment, stunned by his audacity. Then, I found my voice. "Go to hell, Mark," I spat, and hung up. With trembling fingers, I dialed the number of the private investigator I'd hired before. "Rick? It's Elsie Johnson. I need you to dig deeper into my husband's life. His work, his connections, everything. I think he might be involved in something illegal." 2 weeks crawled by, each day a tense waiting game. I jumped at every unexpected noise, scrutinized every unfamiliar face that entered the gym. Mark's threats hung over me like a dark cloud, but I refused to let it paralyze me. It was during one of the sleepless nights that my phone buzzed. A text from Rick. "Need to meet. Information found. Urgent." The following afternoon, I sat in a secluded booth, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. When Rick slid into the seat opposite me, his face was grim. "Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly, "what I'm about to tell you is, well, it's serious. Are you sure you want to know?" I nodded, steeling myself. "I need to know everything, Rick." He sighed, then pulled out a thick folder. "Your husband, Mark, he's not just a customs officer. He's deeply involved with organized crime." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What?" I whispered. Rick's voice was low and urgent. "He's been taking bribes for years, Mrs. Johnson. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. He's involved in human trafficking, smuggling illegal immigrants across the border. And there's more, he's part of a car theft ring, helping steal and transport vehicles across state lines." "How?" I swallowed hard. "How did you find all this out?" Rick looked uncomfortable. "I have contacts in the criminal community, they trust me. But Mrs. Johnson, you need to be extremely careful. The people your husband is involved with, they're dangerous. If they suspect you know anything." He didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood the implication all too well. "What should I do?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Rick leaned forward. "You need to go to the police. Today. Tell them everything you know. They can protect you." The drive to the police was a blur. At the station, I approached the desk officer, my heart pounding. I need to speak to someone about my husband. He's involved in criminal activities." The officer looked up, his expression changing from bored to alert. "Your name, ma'am?" "Elsie Johnson. My husband is Mark Johnson. He works in customs." The officer's eyes widened slightly. He picked up a phone, speaking quietly into it. A moment later, a tall, serious-looking man in a suit approached. "Mrs. Johnson? I'm Detective Ramirez. Why don't you come with me?" Detective Ramirez closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice kind but professional, "I understand you have some information about your husband. Why don't you start at the beginning?" Taking a deep breath, I began to tell my story. The next few days were a whirlwind. After my meeting with Detective Ramirez, things moved quickly. I found myself at the center of a rapidly unfolding investigation, providing statements, identifying photos, and turning over documents. With shaking hands, I pulled up a local news site on my computer. The headline made my heart stop. Major customs corruption bust, multiple arrests made. The article detailed a massive operation involving local police, FBI, and Homeland Security. Several customs officials had been arrested on charges ranging from bribery to human trafficking. And there, right in the middle of it all, was a photo of Mark being led away in handcuffs. I knew this was just the beginning. Linda showed up at the gym, causing a scene and screaming at me in front of my clients. But the worst was yet to come. A week after Mark's arrest, I arrived at the gym to find the locks changed and a notice on the door. It was from the bank, claiming that the property had been used as collateral for loans I knew nothing about. They were foreclosing. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer. "Janet? It's Elsie. I need your help. We're going to fight this foreclosure, and we're going to win." As I hung up, I felt a newfound determination coursing through me. Mark thought he could break me, but he was wrong. This was my life, my business, and I was going to fight for it with everything I had. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and sleepless nights. Janet worked tirelessly, helping me navigate the complex web of financial and legal issues Mark had left in his wake. "Elsie," Janet said one afternoon, her voice serious, "I've been going through the documents. It looks like Mark took out several loans against the gym without your knowledge or consent. He forged your signature on multiple occasions." I felt a mix of anger and disbelief wash over me. How is that even possible? Wouldn't the bank have verified? Janet shook her head. "It seems Mark had some inside help at the bank. We're looking into that now. The good news is, this fraud gives us grounds to challenge the foreclosure." As we fought the legal battle, I tried to keep my life as normal as possible. But normalcy was a distant memory. Every day brought new challenges, new threats. One morning, I woke up to find my car vandalized, the words "snitch" spray painted across the hood. Another day, I received an envelope full of photos, surveillance shots of me going about my daily routine. The message was clear: "We're watching you." I reported each incident to Detective Ramirez, but there was little he could do without concrete evidence linking these acts to Mark or his associates. Then, just as I thought things couldn't get any worse, I received a call from Janet. "Elsie, we've hit a snag," she said, her voice tense. "The judge assigned to our case, well, there's reason to believe he might have connections to Mark's network." My heart sank. "What does that mean for us?" Janet sighed. "It means we're facing an uphill battle. But don't worry, we're not giving up. I'm filing a motion for the judge to recuse himself. If that fails, we'll appeal. We'll fight this every step of the way." That night, as I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at a meal I couldn't bring myself to eat, I hit my lowest point. For a moment, I considered giving up. Maybe I should just walk away, start over somewhere new. But then my eyes fell on a photo hanging on the fridge. It was of me at the grand opening of my gym, beaming with pride and hope. In that moment, something shifted inside me. A fire that had been flickering, threatening to go out, suddenly roared back to life. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. My first stop was the local newspaper. I had avoided the press up until now, trying to keep a low profile. But I realized that silence was only helping Mark and his associates. I met with a journalist named Rachel, who had been covering Mark's arrest and the ongoing investigation. For the next few hours, I told her everything. The years of deception, the financial fraud, the threats and intimidation. I held nothing back. As I left the newspaper office, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For so long, I had been carrying these secrets, these burdens. It felt liberating to finally share them. My next stop was the police station. I had been in regular contact with Detective Ramirez, but today I had something new for him. "Mrs. Johnson," he greeted me, ushering me into his office. "What can I do for you?" I pulled out a USB drive from my purse. "I've been doing some digging, detective. I think you'll find this interesting." Over the past week, I had been combing through years of financial records, emails, and documents. It was amazing what you could find when you knew where to look and what to look for. I had uncovered a trail of suspicious transactions, coded messages, and hidden accounts that I believed were linked to Mark's criminal activities. Detective Ramirez's eyes widened as he scrolled through the files. "This is impressive, Mrs. Johnson. How did you get all this?" I smiled grimly. "Let's just say I learned a few things from my years with Mark. And I had some help from friends in the financial sector." As I left the police station, I felt a surge of satisfaction. I was no longer just a victim, a witness. I was actively fighting back. But my day wasn't over yet. My final stop was my lawyer's office. Janet greeted me with a tired smile. "Elsie, I was just about to call you. I've got some news about the judge." I leaned forward, my heart racing. "Good news or bad news?" Janet's smile widened. "Good news. Very good news, actually. It turns out our suspicions about the judge were correct. The FBI has been investigating him for months. He's been removed from the case." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "So what does this mean for us?" "It means we're back in the game," Janet said, her eyes sparkling. "The new judge assigned to our case has a reputation for being tough, but fair. We've got a real shot at saving your gym now." As I drove home that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. But as I stepped out of my car, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt off. That's when I saw it. My front door was slightly ajar. I reached into my purse, my fingers closing around the pepper spray I'd started carrying. With my other hand, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, keeping my thumb hovering over the call button. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open wider. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. There was a crash from the direction of the kitchen, followed by hurried footsteps. I braced myself, pepper spray at the ready. But the person who came rushing around the corner wasn't some faceless thug or one of Mark's criminal associates. It was Linda, Mark's mother. She looked terrible, her hair disheveled, her eyes red and puffy, her clothes rumpled as if she'd been wearing them for days. "Linda?" I gasped, lowering the pepper spray. "What are you doing here?" She stared at me wild-eyed for a moment, then burst into tears. "Oh, Elsie," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I had nowhere else to go. Mark's associates are after me too now. They think I know things, that I have information. They've been threatening me, following me. I didn't know where else to turn." I sat down across from her, studying her face. The Linda I knew was proud, always perfectly put together. This broken woman in front of me was a stark contrast to that image. "Why come to me?" I asked. "After everything that's happened, why would you think I'd help you?" Linda's shoulders slumped. "Because you're a good person, Elsie. Better than I ever gave you credit for. And because I have information. Information that could help you, could help bring down Mark's whole operation." My heart skipped a beat. Could this be the break I'd been hoping for? But before I could respond, there was a loud banging on the front door. Linda jumped, her face pale with terror. I grabbed her arm, pulling her up. "Quick," I whispered, "there's a back door, through the kitchen. Go." With my heart pounding, I approached the front door. The banging continued, growing more insistent by the second. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and opened the door. Two burly men in dark suits stood there, their expressions grim. They weren't police, I could tell that much immediately. "Mrs. Johnson," the taller one said, his voice gruff. "We need to talk to you about your mother-in-law, Linda." I feigned confusion. "Linda? I haven't seen her in weeks. What's this about?" The shorter man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb with us, Mrs. Johnson. We know she was here." Where is she? Just then, I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder. The men heard it too, exchanging worried glances. This isn't over, the taller one growled. They turned and hurried away, disappearing into a black SUV parked across the street. Moments later, 2 police cars pulled up, Detective Ramirez stepping out of one of them. "Mrs. Johnson," he called out, hurrying towards me. "Are you all right? We got an alert from your security system." I nodded, relief washing over me. The security system, I had forgotten I'd set it up after the recent threats. It must have triggered when Linda broke in. "I'm fine, Detective," I said. "But we need to talk. Something big just happened." Over the next hour, I told Detective Ramirez everything: Linda's unexpected visit, her claims about having crucial information, and the men who had come looking for her. "This could be the break we've been waiting for," Ramirez said, his eyes glinting with excitement. "If we can find Linda and get her to testify." "I know where she is," I interrupted. "Or at least, I know where she's heading." I had slipped Linda a note with an address before she fled, a safe house that Janet, my lawyer, had set up for me in case of emergencies. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Linda was brought in under police protection, and true to her word, she had a wealth of information about Mark's criminal network. Names, dates, bank accounts, she gave it all up. With Linda's testimony and the evidence I had gathered, the case against Mark and his associates became ironclad. One by one, the dominoes began to fall. The corrupt judge was arrested. The bank officials who had helped Mark with his fraudulent loans were indicted. Even some of Mark's colleagues in customs were taken down. As for me, I finally got my day in court. With the fraud exposed, the foreclosure on my gym was nullified. Not only did I get to keep my business, but I was awarded substantial damages for all I had endured. 6 months after that fateful night when Linda showed up at my door, I stood in front of my gym, watching as the grand reopening banner was hung. As clients began to arrive for the reopening, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to find Detective Ramirez. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, a rare smile on his face. "I thought you'd like to know, Mark's sentencing came through this morning. 20 years, no possibility of parole." I nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. "Thank you, Detective, for everything." As he walked away, I took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The betrayal, the fear, the countless obstacles, they had all shaped me, made me stronger. As I cut the ribbon to officially reopen my gym, cheers erupted from the gathered crowd. I beamed, feeling truly happy for the first time in ages,